Now I'm actually going to open another client just to kind of simulate. So notice that as I type gibberish here on the side, it says Danica is typing. You can see that it's real time, right? As I send a message from one window, it pops up on the next window because the server is broadcasting it to all the clients. Hey there, you ever think about what it takes to create a real-time application? Well, in this video, I'm going to show you how easy it is to get started with NestJS and utilizing WebSockets. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to build a real-time chat application that you can build in probably 10 minutes or so. This video is definitely going to be longer than that because I have to spend time explaining some of the concepts, but the code itself is very simple and easy to write. Now, if you don't already know much about WebSockets, you don't really need to know that much to get started. The only thing you need to really understand about it is that WebSockets creates a bidirectional communication between the server and client. And what that basically just means is that the server can actually push data to the client at any time. What you might be used to with regular APIs is that first the client needs to make a request, typically with HTTP, to the server, and then the server responds back with some information. Well, with WebSockets, the server can just at any given moment broadcast events or messages to any client. And that's usually why WebSockets are used for real-time applications, because it can just push data to the clients and it doesn't need to wait for a request. All right, so let's just jump right in and let's build this application. So I've got a terminal open here on the screen, and we're going to use the NestJS CLI. Make sure to install that globally if you don't already have it. So that's just npm install-g at NestJS CLI. And then within my desktop, I'm just going to do nest new chat server. And that's going to create a new application called nest server. And I'll use npm. Now within VS Code, I'm actually going to open up the terminal again, and we're going to install our core dependencies, which is these two things, NestJS/WebSockets and NestJS platform socket.io. Quick pause. You might be wondering what these two things even are. Well, in the Node.js ecosystem, there's really two popular libraries that are designed to work with WebSockets. So there's the WS package, and then there's the socket.io library. However, the way that NestJS interfaces with these libraries, it sort of does it in a way that it tries to stay agnostic. So you can think of it as like a light abstraction above those libraries. So NestJS has a specific API for working with WebSocket code, but the underlying platform or library that we're going to use is configurable. So you can kind of switch between socket.io or the WS depending on your preference. So basically that's why they have this concept of platforms. So if you're going to use socket.io, you're going to use the socket.io platform. There's also one built in for WS. Now for this tutorial, we're going to stick with socket.io because it's been around for a long time. And the nice thing with that is they have a browser compatible client. So that's going to work really nice for when we develop the UI for this tutorial. So make sure to install these two dependencies. Next thing we're going to do is still in the terminal, we're going to use the CLI again to generate us some boilerplate. So I'm going to do nestg resource messages. And this is actually a CRUD generator. However, you'll notice that it allows you to select the transport layer. We're going to select WebSockets. And it'll say, do you want to generate CRUD entry points? We'll hit yes. And then once that's done, you'll notice that when we go to our code, we now have this new messages folder. So the first thing to notice with this code that got generated for us is that there's this new messages gateway. And what that is basically, think of it sort of like if you've ever worked with NestJS before, you've probably made controllers for HTTP APIs. Just imagine that this is really kind of the same as a controller, except that instead of it working with URLs, with an HTTP API, it instead works with events and various events that has specific names, like in this case, createMessage, findAllMessages, find1, etc. Right, so if we were to spin this up and there was a client that connected to this server, if that client sends a createMessage event, this method gets invoked and this code runs, right? So pretty simple. And then you'll notice with, typical NestJS fashion, there is a service, which is where the bulk of our business logic is going to live. Now, the first thing we're going to do here is actually configure cores, because when we make our UI later, as you know, if you try to create a request from your browser and it tries to make that request to something that's in a different origin, by default, it's going to be blocked by the browser without the proper headers coming back from the server. So unless our NestJS server was serving up the client itself, we need to make sure to provide cores configuration here. So just make sure to provide this, and you can improve this as we go. All right, and then let's talk about the code that's already on this page, right? So what do we actually need and don't need? Maybe we should clean up a little bit. So as we said, we use the CRUD generator, so it has create, read, update, delete, but we don't actually need to use all of that, right? So let's talk about what our chat application actually needs. So first of all, we definitely need this create method because we're making a chat application, right? We need to be able to create messages. And then when you join a chat room, you probably want to be able to see the old messages that was already in that room when you joined. So that's why we probably need a find all method as well. There's really no reason for us to have a find one because there's no purpose for you to find a single message. So we'll delete that. And in typical chat applications, you can't really update or delete your messages. Some do, but we'll keep it simple and we'll just delete that as well. And make sure to also delete the ones that are in the messages service, just to make sure we clean this up, right? So you should be left with just a create and find all for both the gateway and the service. Now, obviously, this is not really enough to build a chat application, so we need a couple more things in here. Now, since our chat application is potentially going to have one-to-many users, right? It could be a one-to-one communication between two people. It could be a group chat. We probably want to create some way for our clients to identify themselves, right? Like, who is it that's joining our chat room? So we'll add a new method in here that is just called join room, and that's listening for a event that has the name join. And then another thing that I think would be really cool to implement for our application is a way for the clients to say when they're typing, right? So if you've ever used like iMessage or Facebook Messenger, when someone's typing, right, like it shows you that little animation that says person is typing. I think that would be pretty fun to build for our demo application here, so we'll do that as well. Again, we'll do the implementation as we get to it. Right, again, so just to summarize at a high level, what we're going to do is we're going to have a chat server that allows clients to join and identify who they are, and then they're going to be able to type a message and inform other clients when they're typing. And of course, we're going to allow them to create that message when they send it. And then finally, we're going to allow other users to be able to get the existing messages as they join the room. They'll be able to read the old messages. All right, let's go ahead and get started implementing each of these. It should be pretty quick. So we'll start with maybe the find all because it's the simplest. All it does, right, is find all of the existing messages. Well, before we get started, we should probably define what is even a message, right? So in our generated files, we already have a message entity here. So the first thing we're going to do is just define the schema for this. So we're just going to say that a message has a name, which is the name of the user sending this message. So that's just a string. And then it has text, which is like the message itself. Now back in the messages service, you can really think of this as the thing that interfaces with whatever our data store is for messages, right? So for example, maybe you could use a database and store your messages in a table. In our case, we're going to keep it simple and we're just going to create an in-memory array and we're just going to manipulate that. So I'm going to create a messages array here, which is just a list of that same message entity that we just created, right? So make sure to import that. And I'm just initializing it with a dummy object here that represents an existing message. That way, when we call find all, ideally we should be able to get this. That way we have some initial data, right? So the implementation of this find all service is really just returning this dot messages, right? So it's that simple. If you were actually using a database, then this is just, you'll add a query in here to select all from your message table. Okay, and in our gateway, that's already calling our find all, so there's really not much more to do here. All right, next let's do our create method here. Since you can see there's already an existing create service method, we'll kind of do the same thing here. Notice that it takes in a create message DTO, right? Imagine that this is the object that we expect to come in from the client when they create, when they say, hey, I want to make a new message. So we need to define that DTO as well. And for the most part, this is really just the same shape as our message entity. So we're just going to extend that, right? And how do we add that to our fake database here? Well, you just need to push it in there. So we're gonna do this dot messages dot push, and we're gonna do createMessage DTO. We're gonna add a to-do here to make sure that we improve this later on, because we did say we're gonna implement the join room functionality, right? So that's gonna allow us to identify who the user is, and then we're gonna make sure that when in the future when they create a new message, that it's that specific user and they can't change their name. But before we get there, there's one more thing that we need to add to our create message here. So you'll notice that this does allow us to add a new message to our data store. However, we still need to inform our clients that there's a new message, right? So you'll notice that we can return things from our gateway here. So actually we need to refactor a little bit to make sure that we actually return the created message. So let's do message equals, for now, let's just copy what's in the DTO and we'll push that into the array. And then that's actually the thing that we're gonna return, right? That way, when the gateway calls message service.create, that's gonna bring back the message that got created, and it's gonna respond with that object back to the sender. But that's still not enough. We wanna be able to inform all of the clients, not just the sender, that there's a new message, right? That's how chat application works in real time, is because when it gets a new message, it broadcasts to the rest of the clients that, hey, there's a new message. So how do we do something like that? Now, as we said earlier, we're using socket.io, under the hood. And that's something that socket.io can already do itself, right? It has methods to emit messages to all clients. So if we're able to get a reference to our underlying socket.io instance, we can actually just use that to achieve what we want. And the way to do that is within our messages gateway, we can actually get a reference to that using this WebSocket server decorator. Let's make sure to import that from NestJS/WebSockets. And this server type, we'll want to make sure to import that from socket.io directly. Right, so now you can think of this server object as a reference to the socket.io server under the hood so that we can actually just use it directly. All right, so how do we do that? Well, first of all, let's make this async. That way we can actually await and get the message back from this, right? Await message service.create. And then we still want to return the message to, perhaps if the client wants to get that information back, we'll still return it. But in addition to that, we're also going to emit. So this is the method that's coming from socket.io that allows us to emit events to all connected clients. And we're also going to provide this with an event name. We'll just call it message, keep it simple. And then we pass in the payload, which is just the message itself, right? So that's it. Later on, when we build our chat UI, you'll see this in action, that you'll be able to see that as we send messages, any other open clients that we have, it's going to get that message back as well in real time. But we'll get to that in a few minutes here. Make sure to stick around. All right, so we've got our create and our find all implemented. Let's go ahead and move on to allowing clients to join our room. Now, in our application, there's only going to be one room, so it's going to be super simple. With that said, with socket.io, it actually has really good support for creating multiple rooms so that, you can actually have it join different rooms, kind of like how when you open a messenger app, right? You have multiple different rooms with different people, different group chats, etc. But in our case, we're going to just simulate something simple with just one room. That way it doesn't get too complicated, right? So let's think about what we want in our implementation here. First of all, when a client joins our room, we want them to specify what is their name, right? Sort of like when you join a Zoom call, it might ask you what your name is. So that needs to be a parameter that comes in here. And with events, with WebSockets and the NestJS API, you can actually get access to the payload that comes in via the message body decorator. So this gives you a reference to that payload. Now you can actually also define a key in here, a specific key to extract out of that payload. For example, in our case, we just want name. So we're going to do name, and this is going to be a string. Now, in addition to the name, we also want a way to identify the client connection itself, like which one of the clients is this message coming from? Now we can do that using another decorator, which is the connected socket. And this is going to get us a reference to the client that is sending this message. So this has the type of socket. And you might have noticed that earlier we already imported that from socket.io as well. So that's what that type is. All right, so now that we have a reference to the payload, the name inside the payload, as well as the client itself that is sending this join request, we're just going to go ahead and forward this information to our message service. So we're going to do this.messages service.identify, or you could also name this join if you wanted to, but let's do identify, and we're going to pass in the name and the ID of the client. Each of these connected socket clients has a very specific ID that lets us identify who they are, right? And this is turning into a squiggly because we haven't implemented it. So let's do that next. So in our messages service, I'm just going to add a new identify method that, as we say, takes in a name and a client ID. Both are strings. So now we need some kind of data structure to keep track of the client's name given their client ID, right? So we just need a basic dictionary. Again, you can do this with a database. We're just, again, going to simulate this with an in-memory object. And then as we get each of these identify requests, we're going to update that map to have, a mapping from the client ID to the user's name. So we're going to do this.client to user, pass in the client ID, and set it to the name. This way we can do a lookup given a client ID. And then we're just going to return the values of this object. I'm not sure that we're really going to use it, but you can probably use this to implement a way to find out who's currently online, right? What's the name of the people that are currently online if you wanted to send that to your chat clients. And then while we're here, we'll also add a utility method that allows us to just do a get client by name, because we're going to use this later as well. So make sure to add that. All right, so we've got our join functionality implemented. Now let's wrap this up and do our typing functionality, our way to broadcast when someone's typing. So the only thing we really need to do here is we need a way for a client to signal that they are typing and also be able to signal when they're done typing, right? So that means the way we can represent that is just by sending an event from the client that represents whether or not they are typing. So we can just use a Boolean to represent that. So kind of like how we're able to send a payload up here with a name, we're going to do something similar in our typing method here, except we're going to do, let's maybe do is typing, right? So copy that, and that's going to be a Boolean. So we're just going to say that if that's true, it's a signal that the client is typing. If it's false, it's a signal that they're done typing. And similarly, we also want the reference to the client here, because we need to figure out what their name is, right? So that we can notify the other clients that someone is typing. We need to get what that someone's name is. And remember, we implemented a get client name method in our messages service here. So we're going to use that. We're just going to do name equals get the client's name. Since we have that name, all we need to do now is to inform the clients that that person is typing. Now there's a catch here. You might think that could we just reuse this.server.emit? And that's not a great solution, because this emit will inform every possible client that's connected, even though we only really need to inform the clients except for the sender, right? The sender doesn't need to know that they're typing. They already know they're typing. They're doing the typing. So what we're going to use here instead actually is client.broadcast.emit. Now with client.broadcast.emit, we're saying that we only want to send that to clients except for myself, right? The sender itself. So to wrap this up, we're going to emit a typing event, and we're going to send a payload with the name and the value of is typing. That way we know whether they're starting to type or they just finished typing. All right, that pretty much wraps up our server implementation. Let's go ahead and actually run it just to make sure we don't have any bugs or errors. And real quick, in main.ts, actually, I'm going to change the port here to be 3001, because I'm going to run the UI in port 3000. So at this point, I'm going to go to the terminal, and I'm just going to run start dev. And we just want to make sure that there aren't any errors here. So if you're following along, your terminal should look like this, all green. no red. Right, so far we've just been writing a lot of code, but we haven't really seen it in action. And that's because it's kind of hard to demo this working without a client. So what we need to do at this point is actually build a client that is going to interact with the events that we defined in our messages gateway. So while this is still running, I'm going to minimize this. All right, so I'm back in my desktop here with a terminal, and I'm going to create a new project for the client. Now, what you use for the client really doesn't matter. You can use React, you can use Angular, whatever. In my case here, I'm going to do a simple Vue 3 application just because it's really dead simple to spin up. So I really wanted to keep this tutorial really simple. But again, you can pick whatever you want. I think the code that I'll write for Vue should be pretty straightforward to follow or port over to whatever your favorite is. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do npm init view at latest, and I'm going to provide a project name of chat client. And then I just selected no for the rest of these, again, to just keep it super simple. All right, so now we're in our chat client. I'm actually just going to run npm install in here. And then let's just run npm run dev. And notice that it spins up in localhost 3000. That's why we changed the port of the server to 3001 earlier. All right, it should look something like this. I'll put it on the side for now. And let's start developing, right? Now, before I forget, we do need to install the client library for socket.io. So just do npm install socket.io-client. So get that installed. Let's get to developing. Now, you'll notice on the browser here, there's a bunch of like dummy stuff, right? So just delete that, clean it up. Right, so I pretty much just emptied it up so that we can kind of start fresh. So the screen should be completely black if you're following along. And within the template, I'll just start with a wrapping div. We'll get this a class of chat. And then within our script, let's actually just try to connect to our server, right? So let's import the IO from the socketio client. And the way you make a connection to a socket server, you just do IO with the URL. And if we open up the network tab here, actually, and then if you click the WEBSOCKETS filter here, you'll notice that we do have that connection with localhost 3001/socket.io, right? So that just makes sure that we're able to connect, and we don't see any errors on our console. So that means we've established a connection. We can start working with it. So perhaps let's start with just getting our messages from our server, right? We said that we want to be able to get messages as they join. So we'll import two things from Vue for now, on before mount and ref. So that just allows us to define some local state with ref, as well as some logic that runs when the application mounts. So let's add a messages ref. So that's going to define an array of messages, which we'll maintain as we get messages from the server. And then we'll add a call here to on before mount. What we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, socket, give me my messages, right? So remember that if we pull up our NestJS server, we have this handler for findAllMessages. So you want to make sure the names that you're using matches the names that we have in these subscribe message decorators. So we're going to do findAllMessages, right? So we're going to emit an event findAllMessages. And the API for this method is really the event name, the payload, which we don't really have a payload, so we'll just put an empty object here. And then the third parameter here actually is the response. So if the server responds back with something, this is actually a callback. So we're gonna do response, and when we get back the response, we can do whatever we want with that. In our case, we're just gonna set messages, our state, to equal the response. Right, so the response really here is the messages that we return from the server. All right, so what we're gonna do now is we're just gonna display it on the screen. So I'm gonna add a new div in our template that will have a chat container, and then a container for the messages within that. And we'll just do a basically we're just gonna loop through the messages that we currently have in our state, which if things are working correctly when we connect to our server, this is gonna emit a findAllMessages. It's going to get back our messages. It's going to set the state, and then it's going to update our UI with all of the messages because we're listing out the name in the text. right? So now if I refresh the page, you'll actually see it's small. So let me make it big here. You'll see that we have our dummy message that we had originally, right, in our fake database, which is just my name with a message. So there you have it. We already have this sort of request and response model sort of simulated via WebSockets, right? So now we're able to get messages. Now we also want to be able to update this list on the UI whenever there's a new message. So that's pretty simple. We're just going to do socket.onMessage, take that message and add it to an array, right? Super simple. And remember that now in addition to this, we also want our clients to be able to send the messages themselves, right? So let's create a new method here called sendMessage. And what is that going to do? It's going to emit a createMessage event. So we're going to do socket.emit createMessage. And what's the payload? The payload is some kind of text, and we don't have state for this yet. So we'll write message text, and we'll define that in a second here. And then again, we have a callback for when it responds. Now, if I pull back our server code again to see our createMessage implementation, remember that when the message is saved in our store, we're going to emit the message to every connected client, in addition to returning it as a response. So there's a couple things that we can do here. You could, for example, do messages.value.push the response, right? So that's going to add to our list of messages in our array here. However, since we do have in our server that emit that sends messages to all connected clients, including the sender, we actually shouldn't be doing this. We don't need that at all, because the server is gonna emit a message event, and this handler that we have up here for the message is gonna do the push itself. So we don't have to do that manually down here, right? But this callback is still useful to us because we probably want to clear out the input box. So we're gonna do message text.value, and we're just gonna input that to be an empty array. Now, we didn't actually create this, so we should do that first before we forget. We're going to do in our states here, we're going to do message text equals ref, and that's a string. Now, before we implement this on the template, we might as well just wrap up the rest of the JavaScript implementation here just to be feature complete. So we have the method for sending a message. We also said that we first need to join the room to be able to send messages as a specific person, right? So what we'll do is let's add another state here that signals whether or not we've already joined, as a client. So we'll just do a Boolean, right? Initialize that to false. And then basically we're going to want to flip this once we've actually joined. So down here, let's add another method. We'll just call that join. So this is the method that we're going to call when I actually specify our name. So we're going to do socket.emit join, and we need to send a name for our payload, and we're going to do name.value. And again, we also need the state for that name. Kind of keep forgetting that I need to define those. So let's do name equals ref. That's a string. Initialize it empty. So that's what we're going to pass in here. So as you might guess later, this is going to be the state that is going to be used as a model for our inputs. Same thing with message text here. We'll get to that in a second. Let me just wrap this up. So we're going to emit a join with the name as the payload. And then when we get the response back, we're just going to flip our Boolean, join that value to be true. Now remember that our server implementation of this actually returns the names of everyone that's joined so far. So again, if you wanted to improve upon the tutorial later, you can use that, but we'll keep it simple here. And then finally, let's just wrap this up and implement our typing logic. Basically what we want to do is intercept anytime someone is typing. We want to listen for that event, and then we're going to display on the screen, so and so is typing. So let's also have a state that we can change for what that display might be. So we'll do typing display, and that'll also be an empty string. Now, how would we implement this? Let's make an emit typing method, And basically when we call this method, we want to say, hey server, I'm typing. So we're going to do emit typing. And then remember, we need to pass is typing here to say, yep, we started typing. So this is going to be true. Now we want this to eventually, after a certain period of time, actually also emit that they're no longer typing. So we need to define some sort of debounce behavior, right? So as the user is typing, it's emitting this value, but after a couple seconds when they stop typing, it's going to emit is typing is false. So we can simulate the bounce behavior by just using set timeout. So we'll have a variable out here just to keep track of that, and then we'll just do timeout equals set timeout. After 2000, I think this is milliseconds, we're gonna emit they're done typing. Now the nice thing with this is that as the user is typing, it's gonna replace what's in timeout here. So if they start typing but then they start typing again, it's eventually gonna emit is typing false only when they really are done typing, right? So that pretty much wraps up all of our sort of JavaScript UI logic. Now all we need to do is actually implement the template UI to display all of these things. So right now our UI just looks like this. We just have the list. Now what we really want to do is display some kind of like login screen if they haven't joined yet. So that's very simple. We're just gonna do div vif equals they haven't joined yet. If they haven't joined, we're gonna ask for their name, right? We'll do that in a second here. Else, once they actually have joined, then we'll show the messages. So this becomes a v-else, right? So it's an if-else. So what do we want in here? We just need a basic form that asks for the user's name. So we'll just create a form that will say, what's your name? And we're using the name state that we have up here. That will be the model of our input box, right? So we have what's your name, input box, a submit button, and then on submit, it's gonna trigger our join method that we had up here, right? It's gonna emit with your name. And then finally with our messages, so we already have our list of messages. Within our chat container, we actually want to also add a box here where we can actually type in a message. So we'll do a class of message input, and then we'll have another form in there that basically will just, it has another input box, but it's using the message text as the v model. And then notice that as they're typing at input, we're going to emit typing, which is the method we also defined. And when they hit send, we're going to submit the message, and that's going to use our send message method. And then in between the messages and the input box, that would be a good place for us to display the message that someone is typing. So we're just going to add another div in here that says if typing display, display that text. And now actually remember that we forgot to implement the behavior around typing display. So we have the state for that, which is an empty string, but we need to listen for that event that someone is typing. So in our onBefore mount here, we're just gonna add another listener, and I'll just paste it in. It'll be on typing. We'll get back this response, right, which is like the name and whether or not they actually are typing. And we're just gonna do if is typing is true, we're gonna set the display to be someone the name is typing. Otherwise, we're gonna empty it out. And that should work nicely with our vif here, which basically will toggle that text when there's a value in the typing display. And that's pretty much it in terms of the template and the JavaScript for our very basic client UI here. I am going to add a little bit of CSS. You don't really need to watch me to type that, so I just paste it in here. But basically just a little bit of padding and some heights, and then turning the chat container into a flex, and then just making sure that the messages kind of spans the entire column, right? So let me zoom out our UI here a little bit. So I'm gonna do what's your name? I'll type in my name in here, hit send. So at this point on the server, I'm already joined in the room, and notice that I'm able to see the messages, and then I should be able to Now I thought that we're totally done here, but you'll notice the name isn't coming in. So I actually have a typo here that we need to fix. So I'm gonna open up our server code again. And the typo actually is from our create method in the service. Remember we had a to do improve here. We never actually came back to it. Now what we actually need to do here is replace this message with the name that we use to sign in as a client. So that means that this method also needs a client ID so that when we push the message to our data store, it's going to have the name of the client that joined, right? So that's the missing piece in our to-do here. And we need to go back to our gateway to make sure that we provide that client ID. So we just need to add a reference again to the client here and add in client.id. All right, and I believe that's it. Let me try again with our demo here. So let's get back to our UI. Let me refresh. So it's gonna say, what is your name? I'm gonna put in my name, hit enter. We get our messages. Let's send another hello. And now we're able to get messages. Now I'm actually gonna open another client just to kind of simulate, this idea that you can have one-to-many clients. So let's join as another person. Let's say that let's join as Danica. Hit send, and I'm gonna have a conversation with myself here, but I can be like, hello. And actually notice as I'm typing on the other screen, you'll see the message that the person is typing, right? So notice that as I type gibberish here, on the side it says Danica is typing. And similarly, if I type on the other side as I'm typing, it's gonna say Marius is typing, right? So our functionality is working perfectly. But just to make sure, let's send a couple messages back and forth. Right? And that's it. You can see that it's real time, right? As I send a message from one window, it pops up on the next window because the server is broadcasting it to all the clients. We just talked about the typing behavior, and you're able to get the list of messages, and you're able to log in with a given name. Obviously, it's very simple. If you wanted to make this more of a real application, you could implement like actual logins, using Google Auth or something like that. So that's it at a very high level. I know the tutorial kind of took a little bit of time because I had to kind of explain things, but the code itself is super simple, right? We only really have like a couple methods on the server, a couple methods on the client, and you're able to basically implement real-time chat. So it's very the fundamentals itself is, I think, very easy to grasp. All right, guys, that wraps up our tutorial here. Hopefully that was fun for you. Let me know in the comments if you have any feedback. By the way, I'm approaching 10K subscribers. If you're finding value in any of this content, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed, and maybe I'll see you on the next one.